Hello, folks. I'm Abhishek Agrawal. I'm the head of product management for Defender Experts here at Microsoft. And I'm here today with Jeff Pollard, Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester. We're here to discuss managed detection response, the trends we are seeing, and generative AI. Welcome, Jeff. Nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Look forward to being here.
I'm a huge fan. I have to say, I'm a huge fan of some of your research, specifically the ones that you've done on analyst experiences. So, again, it's a pleasure to talk to you again.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for that.
All right, so let's just jump into it. The first thing we want to understand was, from your perspective, what are you seeing in the attack landscape, how it affects model digital estate, and how do services like MDR services, managed detection response, and generative AI play a role in that?
Yeah, I feel like we say it every year, year after year, and we'll say it again this time. But it's one of those situations where the attack landscape and the threats that we see out there are just increasingly advancing, increasingly difficult to deal with. Adversaries are sophisticated, they're determined. To some extent, they have an advantage over enterprise defenders, and I think this year we've seen that play out in real time, right? With several huge attacks that were kind of front page news. Evolving requirements from a reporting perspective are now making companies have to be much more transparent in terms of disclosing that. And I think this year is really the year where we saw a lot more information from a corporate perspective on how devastating these attacks are in general, right? I think in years past, we've always kind of said that, these things can have major impacts to a business, that cybersecurity is important, it should be a priority. But now that we have the SEC reporting requirements, specifically for publicly traded entities here, now what we're starting to see from an 8K, from a 10Q, from a 10K perspective is exactly how much impact these disruptions can have, whether it's, a manufacturer that can't make or ship or sell its products, whether it's a hotel chain or gaming company that can't check people in, can't check people out, has to fall back on paper procedures. We're now really starting to see the true impact of exactly how important cybersecurity is to the modern organization.
And in that context, like, how are you seeing organizations use MDR services today? What are they finding valuable, and what's on the horizon for MDR space?
Yeah, so I think the way that I see organizations primarily using MDR, and it's in the name, detection and response. Those are historically the two primary elements that organizations are looking for help with when they turn to an MDR provider. The first is detection, because they need someone that's better at detecting things than they are, and that means, one, detecting it, but also detecting it way faster than they could detect it. It's fairly easy to detect ransomware once everything is ransomed. What people that go to MDR need help with is detecting it way before anything gets ransomed, because it's pretty noisy when it happens. And then the response aspect, knowing how to respond, where to respond, what ways make the most sense to respond based on the adversary, the threat, the organizational context, the system importance to the organization. That's really what I find people are looking for when they partner with an MDR provider. But there are some other things as well. I think first, and one of the other things they're looking for is threat hunting, being able to look for a threat in the environment before you know about it. Before the IOCs are released, or before the adversary methodologies are as well known. And when you think about it, most security teams are so understaffed, and I will probably get into that at some point. That when you talk about threat hunting, the thing that most SOC analysts are not going to respond to positively with is someone coming up to them and saying, "Hey, I know you have 100 alerts in your queue right now. What I'd like for you to do is proactively find 30 more." Right? No one has time for that. If the average security leader or VP of security ops goes into the SOC and says, "How about we add 30 more alerts that you don't know about yet on top of the 100 you have?" They're going to have a revolt on their hands, right? Folks are just going to walk out. But that's what an MDR provider can bring to the table, because not only are they finding it, but they're also helping you deal with it. So that threat hunting, which to me is one of the secret sauces of MDR, it's one of the most important parts, because it's one of the first, and I think it's one of the few ways that we have to equalize the sort of battleground between defenders and adversaries, right? Threat hunting is a way to unleash that creativity. And so it's such an important part of MDR that it needs to be kind of a baseline expectation of the service. And so those are the big things I find: the detection, the response, but really that ability to start being proactive and start hunting. That's kind of the trifecta of what's really important about MDR right now.
Yeah, plus one to that, Jeff. In fact, we see the similar trends with our customer base. As you refer, there's a acute shortage of talent, and I think we'll get to that in a minute. But I think some data shows there are over 4 million security jobs that are still vacant. And what we are seeing is combine that with the rate of digital change a lot of our customers are going, along with the sophistication of the attacks, which increasingly are cross domain. Right, it's gone are the days of endpoint only protection, and that's why they're seeking out MDR services like Defender experts to protect them. And as you mentioned, like they are seeking both the proactive threat hunting piece to get ahead of the emerging attacks, but also, in some cases, a 24/7, hey, help me just, alert, manage the alert queue, triage, investigate, and respond. So yeah, we are fully aligned with what you are seeing as part of what we are seeing in our data as well.
So let me ask you this: how does AI adoption affect MDR in terms of what Microsoft is seeing right now?
Yeah, great question. I think, as you probably know, Microsoft is all in on generative AI, and as of this recording, our Copilot for Security product is just about ready to go GA, and it's an ideal offering for an MDR service, right? Like as you mentioned, like security is an asymmetric game, and tools like Copilot and generative AI finally allows to level the playing field for the defenders, right? And as for an MDR service like Defender Experts, we believe this technology can help us deliver better, faster, more scalable services and help our customers, right? In fact, when we look at a function in a SOC, whether it be threat hunting or whether it be an operations engineer or detection engineer or automation engineer, there are opportunities to use this technology to make take the toil out of their lives, reduce alert fatigue, and in fact solve new unique problems that we did not imagine was possible in the past. Let me give you one example. So way back, I used to be a product manager on the PowerShell team, and as we all know, like attackers are using PowerShell in unique ways, complex obfuscated scripts that would in the past take a lot of time to reverse engineer. And now our analysts in Defender Experts are able to use Copilot for Security in literally minutes, reverse engineer a 1,000-line PowerShell script, and then be able to quickly triage that alert. So that's kind of the potential of MDR in this space. So let me build upon that question and see, from your perspective, how should MDR vendors use AI to their advantage to enhance their offerings? Like what would be your guidance to them?
Yeah, I think the example you used is a fantastic one. I think back to, sort of time in the SOC, time that I worked for security services providers in past lives, things that I've seen in demonstrations and talking to SOC teams now in my day-to-day role. And I can't count the number of times that some innovative person within a SOC either had to build or develop themselves or leveraged some open source capability to conduct things like deobfuscation of some script that might be base 64 encoded, right? Just basic things like that, but they had to build and support that capability. And once you build it, then you want even more. And of course, the problem is that once it's deobfuscated, once it's unencoded, it's like, okay, that's great, but do you actually understand the language? Do you know what the script is doing? And so just the ability to see something like not just have the PowerShell script there for you, but also an explanation of exactly what the PowerShell script is doing. So that way you don't have to sort of, alt tab or have another window open to say, okay, what does that do? What does that do? What does that do? So I think first and foremost, right, from an analyst experience perspective, I think one thing that AI can accomplish for us is that it can make the workflow for a SOC analyst much more streamlined. It can reduce the amount of context switching that analysts have to do. And unfortunately, from a security product perspective, this industry has not done a good job of that. Analysts are forced to context switch all the time. And it's such a burden because you don't realize that that's where mistakes happen, right? When your mental load is between, I have to go to this tool to remember how to use that tool to this other tool, that's where copy paste mistakes happen. That's where just errors in cognition can take place because you're moving so quickly. So I think AI can do a tremendous job of reducing that burden. You mentioned drudgery. That's another one. And this is one that I think in particular, early career analysts will get a huge benefit of being able to write up that incident report. Or that explanation of the event to explain it to a team lead or to an executive if they're in that situation, where instead of having to sit down and write what is often a pretty templatized report, but you still had to do all of the individual templatized portions yourself. You had to copy paste, you had to take it from this system to that one. So using AI to write things like that is fantastic. And then the other one, and this is where I actually think what we're seeing is that some of the more experienced personnel are getting real benefits out of it, are things like complex queries, which can be difficult even if you're experienced to write. And it's one of the things I'm most excited about, because I think one of the challenges we have in this industry, and this is true across cybersecurity as a whole, but one of the things that we've done from a technology perspective is that we've trained a lot of experts in how to use a specific tool or technology. What we need in the SOC, for example, is we need investigative experts. We need analytical experts that know how to conduct an investigative process or an analytic process. And if they know how to do that, they can figure out the query language. But the problem is that we force them to learn the query language in some cases and taken away time to learn how to investigate. And one of the nice things about AI solutions in this is that we're not forcing that trade-off anymore, because now you can use these technologies to generate a sophisticated query based on what you're looking for. And the best part of all is that you can get that query back based on natural language. So instead of me having to understand how the technology works, I can instead just understand how the adversary works. And I can type that in, and it may not be perfect right out of the gate, but it's certainly going to be faster than me learning how to do it, or me finding the one sort of tier 3 on the team that is an absolute master of that and taking their time. Instead, now I can do some of that work myself. And that's a tremendous productivity improvement. And it allows us to let everyone become better. But if you think about it in particular, if our most experienced personnel get the productivity benefits for that, generally our most experienced personnel are often some of our most productive too. And so that means that the productivity gain goes from being, a little bit for that tier 1 to a whole lot for that tier 3 when they can spend more time focused on things. So I'm tremendously excited about those kinds of capabilities and us really being able to lean into letting practitioners do the actual practitioner part of their job and not spend all their time fighting with technology.
Jeff, great sense of insights. I mean, that makes sense. In fact, one of the challenges, this is my opinion, is for the MDR service is how do you maintain consistency of quality as you scale? And, the examples that you gave, where you're letting the practitioner be really good at, do what they're really good at and not get lost in the noise of tools. That's the power that AI technology can help an MDR service provider achieve that scale, because they're able to get the most productive part out of their teams. In fact, the example you gave, we have a skill inside Copilot for security for generating from natural language Custo query scripts, which is basically the query language for Defender or Sentinel. And we are able to do that in seconds, not just for our own hunting internally, but also be able to share that back to the customer, so they can now learn and start doing that as well. And I believe this is just the beginning. And if we just let our analysts and our security engineers use this new tool, there's so much more innovative examples that they can come back with and improve their operations over the coming months and years as the space evolves.
Yeah, and so we've talked about scale and we've talked about people. I think MDR obviously helps address some of the talent resource shortages, but how are you seeing that when it's directly applied to MDR from your perspective, right? How is it offsetting some of those talent gaps? And I'll happily chime in after you, Abhishek, to sort of share what I see in my research.
Yeah, and I know, as we kind of referred at the beginning, some data is showing that there's over 4 million security jobs that are vacant. And that's where MDR services are helping augment customers, depending on whatever their maturity level is, right? So with Defender experts, we're seeing customers use it for 24/7 alert triage, investigation, and response, all the way to proactive hunting, for the case where they do not have experts who can find that emerging threat in their environment. The other use case that we are finding is it's not just the work that an MDR service provider like Defender experts can do, but it's also the good collaboration that happens between the customer SOC and an MDR service provider. And in that exchange process, the customer learns, and they get to upskill their team as well. And this is where I would also say MDR and Defender experts or an MDR service or Copilot are complementary, because with Copilot they can upscale their organizations, and with an MDR service, the Defender experts, they can scale out their SOC function. So together they get the best of human expertise and AI to keep the organization secure.
Yeah, and I see similar things in my research, depending on organization size and sophistication. When it comes to enterprise organizations in particular, what I find for them is that it allows them to sort of shift their team's priorities to the things that matter to them. So, let's say that you've got an MDR provider and you've got your own SOC, and maybe your SOC is even 24/7. It used to be in kind of the old world of thinking about this. We thought, well, if I have a 24/7 SOC, then I don't need a service. It was sort of in-house, outsource, and that was the distinction. And I find that doesn't really exist in the same way anymore. Now, what I find is that you can have an in-house SOC, and now what your SOC can do is focus on the commoditized things. If your team isn't as skilled, maybe, right? So, they can work the sort of basic adversaries that you might find, but then you can rely on your MDR provider for the more sophisticated things, or, vice versa, depending on how you've oriented your team. And so on the enterprise side, I find that MDR is really complementary to an organization that might have a SOC and even a fairly extensive SOC around, multiple SOCs around the globe. MDR can still kind of plug in and fit well. What I see when it comes to kind of mid-size and smaller organizations is a little bit different, because what I find there that I think is really interesting is you have a lot of smaller companies that often play, we're right on the cusp of baseball season starting up. So I'll use a sports metaphor. You've got kind of the farm league or the developmental league from a security perspective. So you've got, let's say you're in a major metro area or something like that. You've got a couple grocery stores. Oh, those are lower margin businesses. They typically don't comp as well. Then you've got some banks, and you've got some energy companies, and you've got, companies that can compensate better potentially, maybe even security vendors. And so what winds up happening is that, one of these smaller companies, they can hire someone and teach them security operations. They can develop and cultivate that talent, but they've got like a 2-year window to keep that person. And then they just know that person is going to get swooped up by some other employer in the area. Well, what MDR can do is kind of plug into that and be a smoothing effect, where instead of hiring someone, training them up after 2 years, they've got some good experience, they're really, really good now, and then you lose them, and then you drop back down to having someone that's kind of brand new. Well, instead, that MDR provider kind of smooths it out, where, yeah, you might lose that person 2 years later, but you've got that MDR person to bridge the gap, and they can help that, 3-month kind of newish person act a lot closer to having 1 year of experience, because they're helping to upskill. And so that's the other area where I see that, MDR plugs in. It kind of fits organizations across verticals and across sizes, because there's a natural kind of integration that can work, whether you're enterprise, mega SOCs 5 around the globe in a follow the sun model, MDR can help. If you're a much smaller organization, MDR can also help, just in the point of kind of smoothing out talent and changing the urgency of having a shorthanded security team.
No, Jeff, great insights. So let me ask this. I know you're passionate about SOC metrics. So, if a customer adopts an MDR service, how should they think about metrics and the impact an MDR vendor makes on those metrics?
Yeah. So one, they should get better. Although when we say better, we have to kind of define that. And we actually myself and Ali Mellon just released a report not too long ago about SOC metrics, and kind of shared out some of the standard ones. So I think first and foremost, the way that a lot of organizations measure their security operations, they're sort of leaning on metrics like mean time to respond or mean time to contain, which I think are both certainly solid metrics that organizations can and should use. I think, your average MDR provider should improve those metrics, but you've also got to keep in mind that a good MDR provider also is probably going to find more than you did. So, initially what you might find is a little bit of a dip in those numbers, because you might have more things that you needed to deal with because you simply weren't finding them before. But over time, that should even out. One of the metrics that I love is mean time to investigate, which is kind of that point after detection, and between or before or maybe even during response. So kind of mean time to investigate. The reason why I like that metric is because it's a great process metric that lets you know how efficient are our processes for actually figuring something out, triaging it, determining severity, and then making a decision about it. And it can help you identify some bottlenecks in that process. So I'm a big fan of mean time to investigate in terms of thinking about what are my analysts dealing with? what are they going through. And then the other one, and often MDR providers will include a metric like this, but it's one that customer organizations should also be tracking is, not just how long things took your MDR provider, but how long did it take you to respond to your provider? And how long did it take you after you responded to them to resolve something? Because that's another place where you can identify some bottlenecks. If you've got a provider that can tell you things are happening within 23 minutes, that's amazing. I guarantee you're probably not that fast on your own. But if that needs to sit for 18 hours because you weren't ready for it, well, it's awesome they found it in 23 minutes, but the adversary just had 18 hours and 23 minutes to do whatever they wanted in your environment. And so another big part of that is not just to look at what your provider's doing, which is kind of the way we think about it from an SLA and SLO perspective, but also look at how long that's sitting in the queue for your team to do something with, because that could also identify bottlenecks or headcount problems or other things where you need to be able to jump on alerts faster, because, there's nothing worse than knowing the adversary's there. And I'm kind of preaching to the choir given the service, but there's nothing worse than telling a customer, hey, something's in your environment and it's bad, and knowing that it's going to take them a day and a half to get to it. Right? Because it's painful, like literally painful to deal with that. So I think that's one of those things that organizations really have to keep their eyes on, not just how fast your provider is, but can you match that provider speed? Because you need to be able to.
Yeah, Jeff, great call outs. And, obviously we care about these metrics both internally as a SOC, as we try to, deliver our service operations, but also the outcomes that we want the customers to get through us. And, time to detect, time to investigate, we care about that. We also care about, how is the customer doing in our care? Like, so what's the trend line over time? And hopefully the alert volume is going down. I like the point where, hey, you might see a spurt initially because we are now finding things that were not being in focus before, but then over time, it's decreasing. One of the things we focus on is also not just doing the block and tackle with alerts, but also giving posture guidance, so that over time we hope the posture of the customer becomes better, and so that the incident that were happening or the alerts that were happening in the past don't repeat themselves.
Yep, absolutely.
So Jeff, it's been great chatting. So any final thoughts? How do you think about the MDR AI space? What are your final thoughts?
Yeah, so I think this is the year where we see generative AI go live and GA for MDR, which is great. We talked about some of the benefits that are going to come from it, some of the things organizations are going to get out of it, but that's going to require a lot on the customer side. Part of this is going to lead to a behavioral change. Just because generative AI is available doesn't mean people use it. So you're going to have to get your SOC analysts trained, comfortable, trusting of the technology. And also it means that there's going to be a lot of messaging out there that may or may not be true about exactly what generative AI can and cannot deliver to the average security operations center team. And we already see some of that from a hype perspective. Fundamentally, this technology embedded into MDR, it's absolutely going to make SOC analysts better. It's going to make them more efficient. It's going to make them more productive. But, we're back to the days a little bit of SOAR to some extent, where there were a lot of promises that our SOC was going to be nothing but sort of, T1000s and T900 robots walking around. We're not there yet, right? That's not where this is going. You're still going to need people. You're still going to need people that understand your business and your organization to make those decisions. So we're going to see a lot of promises about AI and MDR and how those two work together. You're going to have to approach those with some degree of skepticism. And also, one of the other things for a lot of security leaders is that if this is the year that we see more generative AI going GA in MDR, well, there's also a budget impact to that. So you've got to make sure that you're thinking about this from a budgetary perspective, that you are preparing your budget to accommodate the kinds of investments that you might need to make, because there's going to be a lot of different pricing models. And I can tell you that we've already seen some vendors that have rolled things out in the early stages, and they had one over enthusiastic customer that started using it all the time. And they had to go to that customer and say, hey, we love that you really want to use our generative AI, but we would like you to use it less, because a spreadsheet that we have with all our modeling for costs, it did not think about you being this excited. And so we're going to either have to charge you more or start charging you in general. So you've got to be really, really cognizant of what's the budget impact of this, so that way you can roll it out effectively, but also get the benefits from it. So there's a lot of things to consider.
Cool. Thanks, Jeff. And again, from a Microsoft perspective, we have this whole end-to-end security vision where we give the customers unified Defender tools, Copilot for security, and Defender experts, along with a rich MDR partner ecosystem, right? So that we can allow the customer to choose their journey based on what their maturity is and get the right mix of human expertise and AI expertise to get them secure. It's Jeff. It's been great chatting with you. This was a great interaction, and thanks to everybody for listening.
Thanks for having me.